Hi everyone and welcome. My first case is one that stayed with me for many years after first reading about it, and to this day it leaves me with so many questions. A Scottish man who murdered 12 to 15 young men was nicknamed the Kindly Killer for a very weird reason. After killing his victims, he lived with their corpses. He bathed them, shaved them, talked to them, watched television with them, and when they became too decomposed, he stuck them under his floorboards to remove them after weeks and sometimes months and burned them in bonfires around which the neighborhood's kids danced and played. I don't know who nicknamed him the Kindly Killer, but this doesn't really sound kind to me. Dennis Andrew Nilsen was born in Fraserburgh, a remote fishing community in northeast Scotland on November 23, 1945, to Betty White and Olaf Nilsen. He was the second of three children. His father Olaf was a visiting Norwegian soldier. He was also an alcoholic and was seldom around. He didn't really participate in taking care of the children, so Betty decided to get a divorce. She took the kids and moved in with her parents. Now, as a child, Dennis was quiet and withdrawn. He was very shy and he didn't have any friends. But he was very close to his grandfather Andrew, with whom he had his only tactile relationship as a kid. He described him as his great hero and protector. And although Dennis was only 5 at the time, he vividly remembers the long walks he used to take with his grandfather and going to the shore, watching the fishing boats. Dennis's grandfather was a fisherman. So he was at sea for weeks at a time, during which life seemed empty to Dennis. On October 31st, 1951, Andrew sadly suffered a heart attack at sea and he passed away at age 62. So his body was taken back home for burial. And when Dennis came home from school, his mother asked him if he wanted to see his grandfather. Of course, he excitedly said yes. So he followed his mother to a room in which his grandfather's body laid in an open coffin. And Betty didn't explain anything. Dennis just stood there and stared at the body. And Betty told him that his grandfather was asleep and that he went to a better place. So in his 6-year-old mind, he wondered, if he went to a better place, why didn't he take me with him? After seeing his grandfather's body, what I believe happened is that his understanding of love that was concentrated on his grandfather and his understanding of death merged, and it created this terrible fusion in his head that love and death go together. After that, the family didn't really speak about the grandfather's death, and it took Dennis months to realize that his grandpa was not coming back. Dennis's mother Betty was a single mother raising 3 kids on her own, and naturally her attention was divided between her 3 kids. But the death of his grandfather already left Dennis feeling abandoned, so he was craving his mother's attention. But she didn't have the motherly instinct to know that he was a special child who needed extra attention. It wasn't because she was wicked or mean, it was just because she was too simple and she didn't have enough emotional intelligence to understand her own son. So Betty ended up marrying a builder named Andrew Scott and went on to have 4 more children with him. At first, Dennis hated his stepdad, but then he came to respect him eventually. The new family situation, however, made Dennis feel that he was losing control and that his mother's attention was driven further away from him. He felt excluded from the happy family picture that Betty was painting. At home, it was also said that he was jealous of his brother Olaf Jr. for the attention he was getting from his mother and grandmother, but he was very close to his sister Sylvia. At puberty, Dennis discovered that he had homosexual tendencies. He was initially confused and ashamed, so he kept his orientation a secret. And in an attempt to convince himself that he wasn't gay, he concluded that many of the boys that he felt attracted to resembled his sister Sylvia, and so he tried to convince himself that his feelings were just a manifestation of the affection that he felt towards her. He even molested her on one occasion to see what it would feel like. Dennis also inappropriately touched his brother Olaf Jr. while he was asleep, but it woke him up and he caught Dennis in the act. Olaf Jr. then started to suspect Dennis of being gay, and he often bullied him and belittled him in public, calling him hen, which is a Scottish slang for girl. As he progressed into adolescence, Dennis's perversion only got worse. His teenage fantasies revolved around death and morbid thoughts. He would often go to the beach by himself and simulate drowning. In September 1961, Dennis joined the army and trained as a chef within the catering division. There, he learned the butchering skills that would later help him dismember his victims. For the first time, he had his own room. His latent feelings started to resurface, but once again, he had to keep his orientation a secret from his colleagues. He would refuse to use the common showers for fear of getting discovered. During his deployment, he also started drinking heavily to ease his shyness, and during that time, his fantasies of sex with an unresistant body evolved to include the dead bodies that he saw during his deployment and an imagery from a 19th century oil painting entitled The Raft of the Medusa, which depicts an old man holding the limp nude body of a dead youth as he sets aside the dismembered body of another young male. He also used his love of photography to convince his colleagues to pretend that they got shot and pose as corpses. It escalated to where he would use a mirror and makeup to make himself look dead and pretend he was looking at a corpse. Then, after 11 years and just before his 27th birthday, Dennis left the army and went back home. He was hoping that his mother Betty would be proud of him and that she would want to know everything about his career plans, but all she cared about was for him to find a wife and start a family of his own. Dennis was starting to feel suffocated in the small village, and on one occasion he joined his brother, his sister-in-law, and another couple in watching a documentary about homosexuality, and they all started to make homophobic comments, except for Dennis. He had the courage for the first time to voice his opinion, but defending homosexuality was seen as a big no-no at the time, so Olaf Jr. went to tell his mother on him, and Betty refused to believe that her son was gay. It wasn't as accepted as it is today. So Dennis decided to leave the village and he never spoke to Olaf again. In December 1972, Dennis moved to London where he found a thriving gay scene and he could for the first time visit gay pubs. He also joined the Metropolitan Police as a junior constable, but he didn't last for long. He quit after 11 months because his personal life was at odds with his job. He then started looking for a relationship, but he struggled to bond and it was difficult for him to socialize in a normal way. Then in 1976, he met a young drifter. He was jobless and he was staying at a hostel, so Dennis convinced him to move in with him and they both rented a flat in Melrose Avenue. It was an old and run-down house, but they negotiated with the landlord to have exclusive access to the back garden. Now, they lived together as a couple and even adopted a dog named Bleep. But after 18 months, David got tired of Dennis's controlling and abusive behavior and decided to leave. And this affected Dennis deeply. It hurt him a lot, and he started inviting more and more people back to his place in the hope that someone would stay. In 1978, he had already spent Christmas alone and didn't really want to be alone for New Year's Eve. So he went out to a bar and he brought home 14-year-old Stephen Holmes after promising him alcohol. When he woke up the next day, he watched Stephen sleep and he couldn't bear the thought of knowing that he would eventually leave. So he grabbed a necktie and slipped it around Stephen's neck and pulled tight. The boy woke up immediately and they both struggled off the bed onto the floor, but Dennis overpowered him. He tightened his grip until Stephen became unconscious. He ran into the kitchen and filled a plastic bucket full of water and then put Stephen's head in it. After a few minutes, there were no more bubbles in the water, and just like that, Dennis had killed his first victim. He then looked after the body, bathed it, put it in bed, and lived with the corpse for over a week. Then, when the smell of decomposition became unbearable, he placed the corpse under the floorboards for almost 8 months. Then he took it out and he burnt the body in a bonfire in the garden and spread the ashes into the ground. On December 3, 1979, Dennis met a 23-year-old visiting Canadian tourist named Kenneth Ockenden in a pub. They drank together for several hours and took a tour of London, then ended up in Dennis's flat. They got along very well, and the more Dennis enjoyed Kenneth's company, the more desperate he felt at the thought that it would soon end and Kenneth would soon leave. Kenneth loved photography and rock music. He was sitting on the bed with his headphones on. Dennis got hold of the headphones wire and strangled Kenneth with it. He placed the body beneath the floorboards and then took it back out several times so that they could sit together and watch television. On May 17, 1980, he met 16-year-old Martin Duffy, who was a runaway. He had nowhere to go and accepted Dennis's invitation to spend the night at his place. After 2 beers, he went to bed, then Dennis climbed on top of him, trapped his arms under the covers, and strangled him. He went limp, but was still alive, so Dennis carried him into the kitchen and drowned him by pushing his head into the sink full of water. Then he took him to the bathroom and got in the tub with him. Again, he kept the corpse in the cupboard for 2 weeks and then he placed it under the floorboards. On August 20th, 1980, he killed 26-year-old William Sutherland. He couldn't remember how exactly, he just remembered strangling him and waking up in the morning to another dead body. On September 18th, 1980, Dennis murdered his last victim at 195 Melrose Avenue, 23-year-old Malcolm Barlow. This one really broke my heart. Malcolm had mental issues and he was also epileptic. Dennis had found him the previous night wandering around outside his home and complaining about a seizure, so he took him inside and called him an ambulance. The next day, Malcolm returned to Dennis's flat to thank him, but he was sadly killed later that night. Dennis said that he found his presence to be a nuisance, and so he strangled him. The next day, he stuffed the body in his cabinet under the kitchen sink. Now, at this stage, he was living in the flat with half a dozen other bodies awaiting disposal, and some of them he had kept in bed with him for sexual purposes for as long as a week. Then, in October of 1981, his landlord asked him to leave the house, and of course he still had a bunch of bodies under the floorboards. So he took them out, he cut them into manageable pieces, and burned them in bonfires in the back garden. He then moved into an attic flat at 23 Cranley Gardens in the Muswell Hill district of North London. And at the new address, he had no access to a garden, and he also had no space beneath his floorboards. So for almost 2 months, he continued to meet and lure men to his flat, but he didn't really murder anyone. In March 1982, Dennis met 23-year-old John Howlett. They had met once in a pub before and had engaged in a long conversation. Then Dennis was drinking alone one day and John walked in and recognized him. They chatted and decided to go to Dennis's place. They had a couple drinks and then John got into Dennis's bed. According to Dennis, Dennis didn't really want him to stay. He wanted John to leave, but John refused to go. So he grabbed a loose strap and strangled him. Now, John was a big guy, and he almost overpowered Dennis, but Dennis managed to strike him in the head and then dragged him into the washroom and drowned him in the bathtub. He then dismembered the body, flushed portions of flesh and internal organs down the toilet, and disposed of the larger bones in the garbage. In September of the same year, he took home 27-year-old Graham Allen, and he prepared him an omelette. Now, bizarrely, Dennis said in his confession that this death was rather odd. He said, quote, "I noticed he was sitting there, and suddenly he appeared to be asleep or unconscious, with a large piece of omelette hanging out of his mouth." End quote. He thought the man might have choked on the food, but since omelettes do not leave red marks on someone's neck, I think we can safely assume that it was Dennis. Nice try, though. Omelettes attacking people. Right. He dissected the body and flushed the parts down the toilet, which started to cause issues in the drains at the residence. On January 23, 1983, he took 20-year-old Stephen Sinclair home after buying him a hamburger. Stephen was a drug addict, so they put on some music and Stephen had some shots and he fell asleep on a chair. Dennis went to the kitchen and grabbed some thick string, thinking to himself, "Here we go again." The string was too short, so he attached it to a tie. Then he sat and contemplated all the pain in Stephen's life and decided to end it for him, or at least that's how he justified it. He went over, made sure that Stephen was asleep, and then strangled him. He struggled slightly and then went unconscious. He was Nilsen's last victim. His head, upper torso, and arms were stored in a tea chest in Dennis's living room. His lower torso and lower legs were kept under the bathtub. On February 9, 1983, a plumbing company was called to 23 Cranley Gardens. The residents have been complaining about a recurrent blocked drain situation because, of course, Dennis had been chopping up the bodies and flushing the pieces down the toilet. So the engineer who went down to investigate the blockage said that the smell that he encountered was the worst he had ever experienced. But nothing had really prepared him to what he found there. What was really causing the plumbing issues were butchered prepared meats and bones. He wasn't really sure if the origin was human or animal, so he decided to come back the next day with his supervisor. And when he was leaving, Dennis and another resident stopped him to ask him what was going on with the drains, is it gonna be fixed? And so he told them that he thought that the source of the substance blocking the pipes looked to him to be human flesh. And Dennis tried to brush the man off, saying, "Well, it looks to me that someone's been flushing their KFC down the toilet." But the plumber was like, "Yeah, nah." He still came back the following day with his supervisor, and most of the remains had disappeared. Naturally, they became suspicious. They still managed to find a few more pieces, so they called the police. A medical examiner later determined that it was actually human flesh and that the pieces came from a human neck, so the victim was most likely strangled. By a process of elimination, the police determined that it had to be coming from the flat of Dennis. They waited for him to come back from work to interrogate him. And when he arrived, the detective introduced himself and told Dennis that they were there about the drains. Dennis asked him, "Since when is police interested in blocked drains?" So they entered his flat, and the detectives could immediately smell the unmistakable stench of decomposition. So they told Dennis that the drains were blocked by human flesh and pressured him about the rest of the body. And Dennis just casually said, "In plastic bags in the other room." In his wardrobe, the police found 2 plastic bags and several air fresheners. The bags contained dismembered body parts and 2 severed heads. In total, they constituted the remains of 3 men. During his interrogation, Dennis couldn't really remember the names of his victims, and to this day, around 8 of them remain unidentified. For the sake of the video, I only mentioned the victims who have been positively identified. During his trial, Dennis was fascinated by the coverage. He enjoyed the attention that he was getting, and even when he was being taken to court, he declined to have a blanket over his head, saying that he had nothing to hide. On November 4th, 1983, Dennis Nilsen was convicted of 6 counts of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder and sentenced to life in prison. In jail, he was assigned his own cell but could mix freely with the rest of the inmates, and the other inmates decided to give him a taste of his own medicine. He was beaten many times, and on one occasion he was cut on the face and chest with a razor blade, which required 89 stitches. I tried to feel sorry for him, but nah. During his incarceration, he filled 50 notebooks with writings and drawings about his life, his murders, and he would frequently allude to his childhood and his grandfather. He wrote, quote, "My trouble started there. It blighted my personality permanently. I have spent all my emotional life searching for my grandfather, and in my formative years, no one was there to take his place." In the prison workshop, Dennis translated books into Braille. He spent much of his time reading, writing, and was also allowed to paint and compose music. On May 12, 2018, he suffered a blood clot and died at the hospital at age 72. His family didn't attend his funeral, but who can blame them, right? Until his death, he insisted that he doesn't know why he did what he did, but he did say that he didn't get any pleasure inflicting pain. It was more about the power and the control that he felt around the limp bodies. They couldn't resist him, they couldn't disagree or argue with him, but most of all, they couldn't leave him. In prison, he also told the story of him drowning and losing consciousness, only to wake up later on the beach with a sticky substance on his chest and an older boy standing over him. He had assumed that the boy rescued him and sexually assaulted him, but he later admitted that it was all a fantasy. And what really happened is that one of the boys that used to bully him in school drowned, and Dennis witnessed the rescuers carry the limp body to the beach. The sight of the motionless body aroused him, and the image stayed with him his whole life. It made him realize that the boy could no longer hurt him, and it made him feel, in his words, supreme, powerful, and confident. He would later go on to recreate the scene with his victims. Some people think that he wanted to be discovered. He had actually written a letter to the building management complaining about the blocked drains, knowing that they would investigate and probably figure out what he was doing. He also referred to the day he was caught as the day help arrived. Now, to be insane means either not knowing what you're doing when you're doing it, or knowing what you're doing but not knowing it's wrong. And Dennis knew what he was doing, and he knew he was wrong. That's why he did what he did to hide the bodies, which technically makes him sane. But then again, this is a person who put someone's head in a saucepan on a stove, kept it simmering all night, and woke up the next morning, prepared himself breakfast, poured himself a cup of coffee, and adjusted the heat on that boiling pot to make sure that the head was cooking properly. So, was he really sane? I don't know. I believe he was a sick individual. He preyed on the lonely people, the runaways, the vulnerable, the ones who would most likely not be reported missing. And it seemed that he only killed the people that he cared about, and the fact that they wanted to leave was the trigger. The corpses were substitutes for real human company, but they also fed his obsession with control. Dennis is often nicknamed the British Jeffrey Dahmer because of their similarities. They were both homosexual necrophiles, both started killing in the same year, and both kept the corpses around, and also both killed out of deep loneliness. What's frustrating about this case is that some of the victims managed to survive. Police were called, reports were filed, but nothing would happen. He would talk his way out of it and convince them that the victim was simply too drunk and imagining things. And what's terrifying is that from the outside, Dennis looked so ordinary. He had a stable job, he had a dog, he was smart and articulate, and it makes you wonder how many Dennises are out there, killing people, disposing of the remains never to be found again. I really hope you enjoyed today's video. I would love to know what your thoughts are. Do you think he was bad or mad, or both? Thank you so much for watching. Please always be aware of your surroundings, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.